Pentru Ucraina mai urmează luni de război, cel puțin luni, asta crede istoricul Mark Galeotti, unul dintre cei mai buni cunoscători ai spațiului ex-sovietic și ai regimului Putin. Putin e lucid și perfect conștient de dezastrul pe care îl provoacă Ucrainei. Cât despre ce urmează după era Putin, Galeotti consideră că potențialii moștenitori nu înseamnă deloc vești mai bune pentru restul Europei. Urmărim împreună interviul acordat de Mark Galeotti, colegii mele, Oana Zamfir.
Professor Mark Galeotti, thank you for joining me today. In your book, We Need to Talk About Putin, Why the West Gets Him Wrong, you say about him that he is not a genius and that the West considers him wrongly to be powerful and dangerous. Do you still believe this after the invasion of Ukraine?
Well, I mean, he's clearly proven to be dangerous to the Ukrainians, but actually, I think really the invasion of Ukraine demonstrates the limitations of Putin's thinking. I mean, let's be honest, this is a man who I think doesn't really understand the 21st century that well. He doesn't understand that power now is not in just how many troops you can send rolling through a parade in your main square. He massively overreached by trying to invade Ukraine, and he did so based purely on his total and utter misunderstanding of Ukraine. Remember, this is a man who doesn't think Ukraine is a real country, who doesn't think the Ukrainians are a real people, and he thought that therefore it would be an easy occupation, at least of the east part of Ukraine, Kiev and everywhere east of the Dnieper River. And in that he was totally and utterly wrong. And again, I think this speaks to the fact that this is not some grand geopolitical chess master who is controlling the world. This is a man who is basically informed by his own prejudices and ultimately, therefore, is destroying his own system as a result.
You are here in Romania for a conference called We Need to Talk About the New Putin. How is this new Putin like?
In some ways, I would say this new Putin is like the old Putin, but even more so. I mean, like so many authoritarian leaders, which Romania itself knows, he's become really a caricature of himself over time. And I think that a lot of the negative trends that we saw before, his unwillingness to believe that there are not deep conspiracies against Russia, his refusal to listen to alternative points of view, to let anyone contradict him, his belief that ultimately he is the indispensable figure, the one great Russian state builder. All of these have come to bear in Ukraine. Clearly there are many people within the Russian system who understood how wrong he was about Ukraine, but none of them could tell him. He's created a system in which everyone's job is to tell him that he's right, to flatter his prejudices and confirm his assumptions. And this is where it's led Russia.
In the first days of the invasion of Ukraine, there has appeared one question. Is Putin mad? What do you think?
I don't think he's mad. I think he believes some mad things. I think ultimately he's a rational individual, though I think less controlled, less rational perhaps than in the past. And again, we don't know if this is just age or whether he is indeed, as some people say, seriously ill. But essentially he's still a rational figure. But the problem is that even rational figures can make dangerous and stupid decisions if they have bad information. And I think that's really the problem, is that the way Putin sees the world is actually very much at odds with how the world really is. And so he makes his decisions as if his view of the world was right.
Also, since the invasion of Ukraine, there have appeared a couple of questions regarding Putin's time left to rule Russia. Is he going to die, being sick, and so on? Is he going to be taken down by a conspiracy? My question for you is, if tomorrow Putin suddenly disappears, will that mean that in that instance the war ends? Will that mean that from that moment on, Russia's attitude towards democracy, towards NATO, towards EU will change?
Big question. I mean, I think the honest answer is, I think if Putin disappears from view tomorrow, we will get not another Putin. But on the other hand, there will be a regime which will be dominated by the figures who clearly have been powerful under Putin. And this will bring with it a change, but we shouldn't assume it's going to be this sudden miraculous change. I don't think Russia is going to become a democracy overnight. But on the other hand, relatively few people within the system, I think, have Putin's emotional, almost gut fear and dislike of the West. I mean, this is the thing that's been really striking, is, watching his speeches of late, reading his texts, is actually the degree to which he's very emotional about the West, and about how he feels the West is hostile to him and wants to bring him down, and Ukraine is just the tool they use. The people who will succeed him will largely be much less emotional about it. And on the whole, these are people who are kleptocrats. They are thieves. They've risen precisely because being a powerful figure in the Putin system is an opportunity to steal on an industrial scale and get away with it. The point is, at the moment, though, they're in trouble because of all the sanctions. They wanted the good old days when they could steal at home and bank abroad and buy their penthouses in New York and in London and generally enjoy the quality of life. So I think what we will see is, when Putin disappears, however it happens, is actually a change in the relationship with the West. They will want to actually improve relations with the West because they will be desperate to have sanctions lifted. They will be desperate to be able to enjoy the quality of, the life that all their money can get them. But they won't be democrats. I don't think we're going to see major changes at home quite yet. But nonetheless, it will be good for us, and it will ultimately be good for Ukraine, because I think at the moment there is no real chance for a peace deal. But on the other hand, one could see a pragmatic regime succeeding Putin deciding to cut its losses and make some kind of a deal that will probably be along the lines of, as long as you don't push us about Crimea, we will withdraw from the rest of your country.
And a follow-up question: if tomorrow Putin suddenly disappears, who could take his place?
Oh, that's the big one, isn't it?
Who could be the next president of Russia? Because I know that you said before the war started that Shoigu could be an option.
Yeah. No, this is it. I mean,
is Shoigu still an option?
I think it's much harder to see Shoigu as president, given that he's defense minister, presided over this terrible war. And also, it will be a lot harder for the West to deal with a President Shoigu, I suspect, because of all the war crimes and such like. It's not impossible, though. He is a very cunning political operator. But I think it's more likely that precisely there will not be one figure who emerges as the dominant one in a post-Putin regime. Instead, there will be a collection of powerful men, and they will largely be men, powerful interests and so forth, who will kind of create an oligarchy. And therefore, the president might well actually be something of a figurehead. It might be a technocrat like Prime Minister Mishustin, who's there just to sort of manage things, or it might be someone who is really just going to be a figurehead, like former President Medvedev. I mean, Medvedev is someone whom, to be blunt, no one else fears. If you just want someone to play the role, he can play the role. So I said, I'm not sure, but in some ways I think that actually who the president is matters a lot less than it does under Putin.
Yeah. 2 days ago, Russia took full control of the Azovstal plant in Mariupol. The remaining Ukrainian soldiers laid down the weapons. Meanwhile, heavy fighting continues in eastern region, in Donbass, in Lugansk. What stage of the war are we facing right now?
I think we're in the sort of last stages of the current Russian offensive. I mean, they clearly wanted to be able to take the whole of the eastern Donbass region. Although they're making some advances, I think they're soon going to be at the point at which they're essentially exhausted. The military call this culmination. And I don't think the Russians have got another offensive in them. I mean, they just don't have the troops. I think unless Putin is willing to actually call this a war and call up the reserves, I think actually soon we will see the battle lines pretty much fixed. Doesn't mean to say that the fighting will stop, but it'll be at the sort of level where one side makes a little bit of an advance, and then maybe gets pushed back, and then the other side makes a little bit of an advance. But in essence, nothing much changes. And I think this is it. We're at that point of deadlock, wherein neither side is strong enough to win the war, but they are strong enough not to be defeated. So this is why I think this war is going to go on for months and well into next year.
You said, recently you said that, in your opinion, this war could get worse from September on. Why is that?
Well, I think it's more that the experience of the war will get worse for Russia.
For Russia.
Exactly. I think this is it. I mean, I think the interesting thing will precisely be that that is, I think, when the real price of war begins to become obvious to the Russian state, but also to the Russian people. By that point, I mean, at the moment, a lot of Russians are having to deal with much higher food prices and so forth, but they have savings. By September, most families will probably have burnt through their savings at the current rate. Likewise, by September, most Russian companies will have used up their reserves, quite often things like spare parts that they'd imported before the war, that kind of thing. So we're probably going to see unemployment beginning to rise at the same time. There's also meant to be local elections in September, governors and councils being elected. Now there's talk about actually these elections being postponed. Well, if the Kremlin does that, it will be quite an admission that the situation is worse than it claims. And yet if it lets the elections go ahead, even if they're stage managed, they become an opportunity for more debate and more sort of essentially chaos within the system. So I think, you know, for a lot of reasons, September, which is also when people start thinking about winter, and actually sort of people are feeling less optimistic psychologically. Yeah. You know, when they come back from their summer holidays and such like, and they look ahead and they think we've got no money, we may not have jobs, food prices are continuing to increase. That, I think, is when we're going to see this sort of trouble coming to roost. And for one last reason also, that's when the autumn conscription season begins. That's when young men are going to be called up to arms, about 130 to 140,000 of them. And by that point, they'll have heard much more about what's going on in the war. And so we may well see a lot more draft dodging. Again, this is another one of these signs that Russian society itself is beginning to think, this war is not good for us.
By the way, Russia is facing right now a shortage infantry in Ukraine. Russian officials already talk about a law that would eliminate that age limit for military contract soldiers. Despite all this, as you have said already, Vladimir Putin so far was against declaring a large-scale military draft or formally declaring war on Ukraine. Is that only a matter of time?
Not necessarily. Look, this is classic Putin. He does not like making a decision when all the options are bad. And look, if he declares war and can begin to mobilize, yes, he will have some more troops. Only a certain number, because there's just a limit to how many the military can accommodate. But still, he'll probably have between 100 and 150,000 extra troops, which is quite a significant additional force. But it's not an instantly war-winning force. But on the other hand, if he does that, first of all, there'll be an impact on the economy, as you're taking people out of the workforce. More importantly, it'll have a massive impact on society. I mean, how can you claim this is just a sort of, you know, limited and successful operation, and then now turn around and say, actually, it's a full-scale war, and we need to, you know, draft your husbands and brothers and sons and boyfriends? It really will bring the war into most people's lives.
Așadar, Putin este lucid și conștient de ce face în Ucraina. Domnule profesor, Dumitru Porțun este alături de noi în continuare. Ce v-a atras atenția?
Da, Mark Galeotti a spus câteva lucruri esențiale. În primul rând că Putin nu înțelege secolul 20 și așa este. Există un fenomen întâlnit la mulți lideri la nivel mondial, când formulează probleme noi în termeni vechi, pentru că gândirea lor a fost formată în altă epocă. 2. Are o viziune mesianică. Atât un fel de mesianic înseamnă salvator, da? Rusia ca salvatoare, el ca persoană salvator. Este o viziune mesianică și despre Rusia și despre el însuși. 3. Putin este un sistem, nu e doar o persoană. Iată de ce, dacă el ar muri mâine, lucrurile nu s-ar schimba în mod esențial, pentru că sistemul rămâne. Va apărea un alt Putin, spune Galeotti. Dar, pe de altă parte, vor apărea niște schimbări, pentru că Putin e și o resursă semiotică. Ce vrea să spună? Că ar dispărea liantul acela simbolic care îi face pe toți să se coordoneze în jurul lui, să se unească în jurul lui și să-și concentreze forțele. S-ar putea să apară o slăbiciune și o slăbire a puterii la Kremlin, a sistemului.
Mulțumesc tare mult, domnule profesor, pentru prezența la ediția specială. Noi luăm o scurtă pauză și revenim de la fix.